in this church, whenever one gets to this stage, it's kind of overwhelming because so much has usually happened before the preacher gets to the pulpit. And believe me, this preacher, who is getting rather long in years and not very with it, feels very left behind sometimes. So I thank you all for the wisdom and the sharing that has happened this morning. But I do believe still, as Cal said, that God is moving, and even in what I have to say, whether it be much more simple and straightforward, God has something for someone today in these notes of mine. And so I just give them to him, and I pray you will hear them in that sense. You may remember about a couple of months ago, Ken, who I don't see him here today, but when Ken got up to preach, he made this startling confession to us. Do you remember that? He said that he had to confess that he had an obsession with zombie movies. And we all, And I have a confession. I thought I'd follow in his footsteps. Mine isn't half as spectacular. I have a great liking, shall we say, not an obsession, with British TV movies and series. So if we're all coming clean, I would like to lay that before you. I do really, really love British TV and movies. I never listen to anything anymore on cable. I turn immediately, once the depressing news is over, I turn to BritBox or Acorn, and I watch all these shows, and many of them are lovely, homey people, with bad teeth and funny hair, real people. Not the glamorous people we used to, but I also watch quite a lot of detective shows and police shows. It's not really what I would have thought I would enjoy, but I've noticed something in all these British TV detective police shows. Whenever the bad guy is getting away, and everybody's discussing it, and they sitting together, they always get together with the blackboard with pictures on it, how they do, and then they'll say, well, is there CCTV of where he was? And there always is. It's amazing. In these tiny little towns in England, they've got CCTV at every grocery store and everywhere you go, and the policeman or someone will go and pick up the film or whatever it is that you get from, I don't even know, from CCTV, and there on the screen you can see the bad guy and you can see which direction he went in. Now this puts people like Sherlock Holmes with his magnifying glass following the footprints in the dirt, puts him in the shade, because now the bad guy hasn't got much of a chance. If he's been caught on CCTV, he has been seen, he has been observed, and now there's evidence against him, and his days of crime are over. But some of these crooks, I'll tell you, are very smart, and they've learned how to hide from the CCTV camera, and they know the blind spots that they can get away with, and then maybe they do get away. But what I wanted to think about this morning was, we have, in a sense, many of us probably grew up with this image that up there in the sky there was this great and almighty CCTV eye watching us. I wonder how many of you were actually rather frightened of the idea that your parents would tell you, God can see when you do bad stuff, and he's going to get you, probably, is what they told you. And that's a different thought. We've been rejoicing this morning, as we should, in our great and wonderful God. But is there sometimes that feeling in your heart, he's seen everything I do? Can I hide? Can I find a blind spot? It doesn't seem as though we can, because the Bible tells us very decidedly the nature of God. And I picked 3 verses which Brad very kindly has put on the overhead for me, just for us to look at that and realize what the Bible says. In the book of Job, his eyes are on the way of mortals. Isn't this scary? He sees their every step. As you're running away, he's watching you. And then in Proverbs, the Lord is watching everywhere, keeping his eye, my version says, or keeping watch on the wicked and the good. That CCTV eye following us. And in Hebrews, even Paul says, nothing in all creation is hidden from God's sight. Everything is uncovered and laid bare before the eyes of him to whom we must give account. If you think about those verses, what do they really awake inside of you at times? Are they terrifying, or are they comforting? Or are they both? What I would like us to do today is just take a look at this God who sees as we are taught, and consider some of the ways in which he sees us. That CCTV is very impersonal, but our God is alive and very much connected to us. How does he see us? And in what ways does he look at us? And first of all, there's one way that we cannot avoid, as we saw in those verses. He sees our sin and our need for mercy. And we know perfectly well how easy it is to try and get into that little blind spot of the CCTV in the sky, because we don't really want God to see all the stuff in our lives. We try to hide. And that's exactly what happened to the very first people God brought onto this beautiful earth. On the day that shame came into the world, man started trying to hide from the God who sees. In Genesis chapter 3, after they have chomped down on that apple they were not supposed to touch, the first man and the first woman stood suddenly still. And the Bible says, at that moment, their eyes were opened, and they suddenly felt shame at their nakedness. So they sewed fig leaves together to cover themselves. And when the cool evening breezes were blowing, the man and his wife heard the Lord God walking about in the garden. So they hid from the Lord among the trees. That's kind of pathetic when you think about it. They hid amongst the trees, wearing these silly fig leaves. Yeah, how uncomfortable, how ridiculous. We didn't really start off very well in our history. My great-grandkids just love to play hide and seek, and I'm sure I've shared this with you before, but you know, little kids, they get a good hiding place, and they keep going back to the same one, even though you know perfectly well where they're going to go. And in my house, there are these curtains in the drapes in the dining room, and the little guys will always get behind the drapes, you know, and you'll be walking through, because usually Nana has to be the one who's doing the searching, and you'll see the drapes sort of shivering a little bit, and you'll say, oh, I wonder where they are, and you walk around, and oh no, it can't be in here, and there's a little sort of snort or giggle from behind the drapes, and then you look down, and at the bottom of the drapes, there are these little socky feet, and the toes are sort of wiggling with excitement. And you walk into the kitchen and say, oh no, they weren't there, we'll have to look somewhere else. Well, I almost get the feeling that Adam and Eve were just as foolish in their hiding. Fig leaves, please, really. Jeremiah quotes God this way, who can hide in secret places so that I cannot see them? Do not I fill the heaven and earth, declares the Lord. Who can hide from God? Maybe that's an upsetting and a depressing thought when we look back on our lives and realize that nothing we've done has been hidden. We've grabbed those grape leaves or those fig leaves or grape leaves, whatever we had nearby, and we've tried to hide behind them. But we know that our God, nothing in all creation is hidden from him. And this could be a devastating fact from the very get-go, from the very beginning. But there's this beautiful, beautiful follow-up in the book of Genesis. And the Lord, when he found them, and he knew where they were, made clothing of animal skins for Adam and his wife. You know, I woke up this morning, and this doesn't happen to me very often, but I was tired, and it hurts quite a bit when one wakes up at my age, so I was lying there feeling a bit sorry for myself. And I had this sudden picture of loving hands coming down with brown clothing, skins, and dropping them onto shoulders, covering up the silly fig leaves, covering them with the skins of animals, covering them after blood has been shed, innocence has been lost, perfection has been spoiled in the garden, sacrifice has been made, covering them with a foretaste of God's plan for us. And God said to me, the eyes that watch us are not the eyes of an accuser. They're the eyes of a redeemer. And that took away the backache, I'll tell you. I think we need to remember that, first of all, if there's anyone here who's sitting with this load of heaviness, hiding, hoping it won't be seen, we have a Redeemer, and he provided the covering for our shame. Our God who sees. He sees our sin and our need for mercy. And a couple of weeks ago we sang this hymn, and it just resonated with me. I run into your arms, unashamed, because of mercy. Praise God. Praise God. Adam and Eve didn't know about that. They couldn't run into his arms like we can. Our God who sees is a redeeming God. He's also a very personal God. You know, in the city how the helicopters used to anyway, go around like an eye in the sky watching the traffic, and they would report on TV that there's a big jam up here because there's been an accident, or everything is flowing freely across the bridge, and we would know that this big eye in the sky was keeping watch on the traffic. And that's a very useful service that we have. But when God looks at us, I don't think he's anything like that. The guy in the helicopter looks down and he sees myriads of cars all going in different directions. And when there's a crash up, he sees that, and he sees all the hold up. But he doesn't see what's inside the car that had the accident. He doesn't see why things are so slow, why this car in the front is trudging along. He doesn't know that the engine is failing. He doesn't know that the people in the accident are bleeding and hurt. He doesn't know that someone there who's speeding is so anxious to get home because his wife is about to have a baby. He just sees the little ants, the cars, and the pattern on the ground. Our God who sees, he sees our frailty and our vulnerability. In Psalm 7, the psalmist says, "You look deep into the mind and heart, O righteous God." He's not just looking down and seeing our sin. He's looking into our heart and into our mind. And he sees our hurts. And he sees our needs. And obviously the perfect person to pull out here as an example of the way God sees the vulnerable is a little Egyptian maid in the camp of Abram and Sarah. In the days when God is creating his people, his nation, exciting days. But God has time at that point to look into the heart and mind of someone who's very confused and very lost. Hagar was an Egyptian slave, servant, presumably a slave with no rights. And she was in the camp while Abram and Sarah were debating how God was going to create this new nation. And this elderly couple hadn't really got to know their Lord very well by that time. Their names hadn't even been changed by God. And they knew that they were supposed to bear children to create a nation, but like all of us, they really wanted to get the lead out and get some action here, because neither of them were getting any younger, and that's putting it mildly. And so we read in Genesis chapter 16, "Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had not been able to bear children for him, but she had an Egyptian servant named Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, 'The Lord has prevented me from having children. Go, sleep with my servant. Perhaps I can have children through her.' And Abram agreed with Sarah's proposal. So Sarah took Hagar, listen to the wording, she took Hagar, the Egyptian servant, and gave her to Abram as a wife." You can see how Hagar was considered a piece of property. She took her. She didn't even mention her name. "My servant, here she is, you have her. We'll do this thing that God is taking so long to do after he's promised. We'll get things going." And so Hagar was used. And when she started just becoming a little bit sure of herself as she discovered she was pregnant, she landed in great trouble, because then Sarah really turned on her. And so this little invisible one, this little girl, this little person with no identity, no rights, ran away, just what we would do. She was alone, she was alien, she was someone's property, she was nameless, she was invisible, and she was used. No wonder she felt a little bit down. And so she wandered out, trying probably to find her way back to Egypt, where people knew who she was. And that's when our God, who sees our frailty and vulnerability, saw Hagar. And the beautiful thing is, the first thing he does is call her by her name. I wonder how long it was since somebody had done that for her, made her someone special. And this was God. Not her God, up until that point, but the God of Abram and Sarah, who still didn't realize what kind of God he was. There's a beautiful song, He Knows My Name, and it always touches me because as I get older, this is one of the things that's very frustrating. I forget people's names. And when you go to someone you like and know, you want to greet them with their name. It's a way of making them aware that you and they have a real connection and a bond. It's very frustrating, and I pray you forgive me for that one. But God knew that Hagar was a special person. And so he calms her, he speaks to her, and she gives him a name. She calls him the God who sees me. And he's our God who sees us too. Years ago, I don't know if many of you will remember, the royal family came to visit us here in Campbell River in Courtenay. Must have been just Courtenay, because I know we went down there to go and see them. And, pardon me, we lined up on the sidewalk outside Lewis Park, and the motor cars were coming past with all the royal family. And just as they got near us, we were standing, and I had young kids, and I had a young teenage girl with us. Sorry, I'm glad you didn't spill this, Jeff, wherever you are. The young girl next to me it was a hot, hot day, and she had one of these big floppy sun hats on. And we were standing there melting in the sun waiting, and at last the cars came, and they moved very slowly. And wonderful thing happened. Just as they got near us, right in front of us on the road, the royal car stopped. And we were waving our little Union Jacks, I guess, and sort of a little bit taken aback. And Prince Philip looked across at us, and there was Heather with her big floppy hat. And he leaned over the side of this very fancy car, which was open, of course, and he said, I like your hat. And I can't make up the beautiful English accent. But Prince Philip spoke directly to little Heather. And, she grew 6 feet at that point because it was such a special thing. And then the car went on with Prince Philip and the Queen. But, oh my, we felt like we'd been touched by royalty. Can you imagine how Hagar felt? He is the God who sees me, El Roi. He sends her back to the camp because he has a plan for her. But he sees her, and he loves her, and he makes her realize that the God who sees is her God. The God who sees also sees our potential. What he created us to be must be very frustrating for him at times when we go off, just as Sarah did, making our own plans on his behalf. The sculptor Michelangelo said that when he looked at a great big block of marble and he was going to create one of his wonderful masterpieces, he didn't stand back and imagine the form and the figure that he was going to carve. He said, I see what is already in the marble. The man is inside there waiting to be released. And I think that's how God probably sees us. He creates us with an image of who we are to be. Sometimes we don't quite make the mark. We don't listen, or we don't hear, or we don't understand. There's a perfect example of this in the book of Judges. A man who was a wimp, to put it mildly. He really wasn't a great man of God. This is the story of Gideon. The angel of the Lord came and sat beneath the great tree at Ophrah, which belonged to Joash of the clan of Abiezer. Gideon, the son of Joash, was threshing wheat at the bottom of a winepress to hide the grain from the Midianites. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, "Mighty hero, man of valor, the Lord is with you." Now, this is kind of an awkward situation in two ways. First of all, because he's hiding. And so when this great declaration is made, I'm sure his first instinct was, shh, shh, I'm not really here. Because he is a man who is afraid, as are all the Israelites in his area at that time. And he is afraid, so where's this mighty hero, man of valor thing come in? This is the God who sees. And he sees this man who is doing something really strange. He's threshing wheat, but he's down in a wine press. And the wine press is down below in a sheltered little knoll where there's no wind and breeze to blow debris into the wine. It's not an appropriate place at all. Why isn't he up on a hill threshing the wheat? That's where you go when you hammer the wheat, whatever you do to it when you're threshing, and then you throw it up and all the chaff blows away in the wind, in the breeze, and you have the pure wheat. What is this man doing? Hiding away in a wine press. And look at the pathetic wheat he's achieving as a result of his efforts. The God who sees can see that this is a frightened man who lives amongst a group of frightened people, because the Midianites have been terrorizing them for years. And in history, this is what God had allowed to happen, because these people had stopped worshipping him and had brought in idols and were worshipping other gods. Well, you can imagine how nervous Gideon was when he is told, "I have a task for you. You are a man of valor. You are going to go and defeat the Midianites." And we can imagine the excuses and the knocking of knees. And one of the things is, I'm the youngest in my family. I'm just the youngest. And my whole family's the least in our clans. And we don't count for anything in this town or in this countryside. Go and get yourself a more appropriate hero and leave me to doing my wheat, because I'm hungry and my family is hungry. And the Midianites have taken everything. And as soon as they see I have wheat, they will come down and take this as well. He's a scared man. He's a nervous man. And before he really will believe the Lord, he goes through all the things that we do when God sends us on a mission we think we cannot achieve. But God looked into the marble and he saw that Gideon could be a warrior if he was going in the Spirit of God and with his courage and with his strength. And so while Gideon goes through every excuse in the book and puts our tests, enough to try the patience of most of us, finally we know the end of that story. The world saw a wimp, but God saw someone who could win the battle for him. He saw what he had planned for this man. He saw him. God's work of grace finally achieved victory. And with Gideon and with God's strength, the Midianites were vanquished. If we're afraid we can't do something that God sends us to do, and there are lots of those kind of things in my life, remember, in his strength, we can do anything. And he can see us, and he knows what he has planned for us in his service. Our God also sees our need for reassurance and comfort. I think in these days, and we've touched on it so many times in so many sermons recently, we're living in this strange, strange world, aren't we? It's just, in my lifetime, I can't believe the difference in the mindset, in the, just the lifestyle, in every value that is out there in our world. And it's frightening, and it's worrying for our children and their children and their children. It's worrying for the people of God. We need reassurance and we need comfort. And our God is a God of comfort and reassurance. The last example I chose is someone who to me represents this, but it's not quite a legitimate choice. This is a man that we really know nothing about. So I thought he would be a good one to represent every man, as it were, every woman. I don't know how many of you are watching The Chosen, and I realize there's some discussion and controversy surrounding that series. But for me, having watched it over the various series, one thing that's really happened with this is it's opened up the concept of the disciples, the people that Jesus chose, and it's made them into real people in a very skilled way. You know, we grew up with the disciples in their bathrobes and their headdresses walking behind Jesus, and they were like a lot of Ken zombies, maybe, in a way. We didn't really have any personality for them. Peter we could relate to. We knew he was a bit bombastic and rushed into things, but most of them we really just saw as this little group of 12 in stripy shirts following Jesus. And we have to think about how he must have molded and taught and shown them the ways of God. These were just ordinary people like you and I. And so the person I've chosen to represent us and our confusion and our sometimes disappointment in life and all the other things that you may be feeling this morning in your life, I've chosen Nathaniel, one of the disciples we know very little about. And the makers of The Chosen have chosen to give him a life story. And it's a very credible one, and I find it quite moving. They make Nathaniel an architect, a designer of beautiful buildings. And he is a Jewish man who wants desperately to create something beautiful to glorify God, the Jewish God. But he lives in a Roman-occupied area. So it has been a huge privilege and actually a tribute to his expertise that he's been chosen in a Roman town to design this great and wonderful building. And he's doing it for the glory of God. But unfortunately, he is working with a Roman crew that doesn't care about that. They want to see this big building go up, and they want it to go up fast, and they want to look good. In the front of this building, I haven't got all the details in my mind, but watching the episode, there are great huge pillars. And anyone who's ever mixed cement knows that when you mix cement, it has to sit and cure and harden. And this is the case with these great big pillars that are to hold up everything. And Nathaniel is insisting that the builders wait. But the Romans, who are the foremen and the workers, they want to get on with the job. And they don't think he knows anything about what they're doing. And they don't care, because he is, after all, just a Jew. And so they carry on. And he is angry and worried. And then when he's afar off, he hears this dreadful, awful crashing sound. And the whole building, this whole great, big, beautiful construction comes down with a mighty crash. And of course, he is the one who's to blame. He was the one who designed it. He was the one who created these big pillars. And he is in complete despair. And so we see him going out into the wilderness, and he's got with him all these wonderful plans on paper that he has, the designs for this building that he was going to do as his glory for God. And he can't understand how this could have happened. And he sits under a tree, and he calls out to God. And he says, "Don't you care? Have you forsaken me? Why have you forsaken me? Can you even see me?" And it's a very, very poignant and difficult scene to watch. And then he burns up all these wonderful plans that he had made. And he goes home and he just lies on his bed. He has nothing more to live for. He's lost his job. He's lost his good name. And God has forsaken him when he tried so hard to glorify God. And I'm sure for each of us, there's a little bit of that kind of story in our lives when we felt let down, when we felt misunderstood, misused, disappointed, and maybe even left alone by God. And this is the story in John. Philip, who had come to Jesus, went to look for Nathanael. And in the movie, he finds him lying, dejected and crying. And he told him, "We have found the very person Moses and the prophets told us about." As they approached, Jesus said, "Now here is a genuine son of Israel, a man of complete integrity." "How do you know about me?" asked Nathanael. And Jesus replied, "I could see you under the fig tree before Philip found you." This is really, when that particular scene came, I realized how Jesus in God has seen us all, and how well he knew those disciples he called. And I do think that Nathanael's story must have been something like this, because Jesus would never have said these words, "I could see you under the fig tree," which obviously was going to have an impact on Nathanael. He wasn't saying, "I'm supernatural, I can see beyond you, and I could see what you were doing." That was not how Jesus was or is. So I presume that there was a story behind Nathanael that Jesus could see. So I would pray that we today would remember that God sees our need for reassurance when we're down, when we feel that the world has turned its back, that sometimes that he has turned his back on us. He says, "I didn't forsake you. I saw you. I was there. I love you. You're mine." And like he said to Nathanael, "Come and follow me." In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus, when he's talking about prayer, talks about the God who sees in secret. He knows our private lives. He knows our private vows, our thoughts, our secret little ups and downs, our big ups and downs, and the little ones that sometimes are almost harder to bear. So let's remember, if this is our prayer, this speaks to some of you, if we're trying to cover our shame with fig leaves and bravado and hiding, he sees us. You look deep into the mind and heart, O righteous God. And if you feel invisible and a nobody, like little Hagar, he sees you. He knows your name. He's the God who sees you. And if you feel life is just overwhelming and it's scary and you don't know what you can do to make a difference and you just want to hide and go and get into that wine press where no one will see you in a useless act, remember, I see you. I see what I'm meant for you to be. You can be brave. You can be strong. I will send you in my strength, and we will be victory. And finally, if you feel forgotten, let down, unnoticed, unappreciated, remember, you're his beloved, and he sees you, and he sees me, and he loves us so much. Praise God. Can I ask